It looks like we're getting ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to Daniel Williams to begin.
Thank you, Jessica. Welcome to part 2 of our special session titled Increasing Social and Ecological Resilience to Wildfire Risk, the Role of Collective Action. We had 5 very interesting papers this morning, if I can't say myself, or maybe it was afternoon for some of you, but anyway, it's morning for me. I'm Dan Williams. I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins, Colorado, so in fact it is still morning here. And I will help moderate this session. The session asks, how do we address wildfire informed by an understanding of a need for collective action? The session will examine ways to frame wildfire risk as a boundary crossing collective action problem to deepen our understanding of collective solutions and the role of landscape-based context informing wildfire adaptation strategies. We've got 5 presentations. The first presentation will be given by Erin Belval on shifting wildfire operations in the face of COVID-19 global pandemic. And she is a research forcer with the Rocky Mountain Research Station and part of the Human Dimensions program there. So I'll leave it to her to introduce the rest of her supporting cast.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, or at least great to be able to see your names, I guess, which is what I can see right now. When the idea for this session first came about, the idea of increasing, particularly for me, social resilience when considering the role of collective action, this seemed like a really perfect place to speak to some of the research that me and my collaborators have been doing over the past couple of years in addressing COVID-19 spread mitigations within the wildland fire operation system. The collaborators on this, Matt Thompson, Karen Short, Karen Riley, have been absolutely integral to all the projects here. And it was really fun to talk with them about, let's speak to some research about how we want to give a presentation to talk about how research was able to give policymakers and those on the ground context, information and insights that would be useful as we were figuring out the whole COVID situation in the context of wildfire management. So I'm first going to speak to what COVID management looks like within a wildfire system. I'm then going to speak to some of the projects we were involved with, particularly ones that I personally was involved in. And then I'll speak to some of the takeaways I'd like you to take away and looking forward into the future. All right, so when we're talking about COVID mitigation within a wildland fire system, it's absolutely a problem that can only be addressed collectively. And there are 4 main levels at which we can see these different pieces of action. There's the personnel level, so that's your individual level mitigation for, okay, I'm going to take this action personally to make sure COVID's not spreading. There are actions that can be taken at the crew level or like the engine module level. There's actions that can be taken at the incident level, and there's actions that can be taken at the system-wide level. And most of the COVID spread mitigations that occurred in 2020 and 2021 fall pretty neatly into one of these bins. So for example, at the personnel level, COVID-19 spread mitigations that can be taken are masking, social distancing, increasing your hygiene, personally deciding to be tested or screened, and then in 2021, of course, vaccination was an option. All of these actions taken by a single individual can certainly reduce the risk to that individual themselves, but taken collectively across the entire system can have enormous impacts on reducing the spread of COVID-19. At the crew level, there were fewer examples here. One of the key ones, many crews chose to do this module as one mitigation, which is to say they treated their crew as a pod and they tried to minimize interactions outside their own pod. So that was a crew level mitigation that was taken on fires to try and stop spread of COVID-19. And again, taken by one crew, that helps reduce the risk to the crew itself, but taken across the system by multiple crews really reduces the spread overall, right? There were mitigations that were taken when crews were moving between fires, to and between fires, so transportation, the exposure they had when they were traveling, things like how many cars should we be traveling in, that sort of mitigation was what happened at the crew level. There were quite a few mitigations at the incident level. So one good example is incident management teams for large fires. Many of those positions on the incident management team, due to technology, were able to actually function remotely. So analysis type positions. And so those people weren't actually at camp, so they couldn't actually spread COVID because they were at home, right? Changing around how large fire camps were laid out was a big one. So dispersing people so that we didn't have a large concentration of people all interacting with each other. Increasing hygiene measures at camp, so availability of hand washing systems, showers, sanitizer, that sort of thing. Virtual briefings and paperwork, again, reducing contacts between people. And then testing and screening protocols that were actually implemented at that incident level. Those were all important mitigations that occurred across the system. And then at a system-wide level, considering how to minimize COVID-19 spread throughout the system was also really important. So things like travel regulations, mobilization checklists. If you wanted to travel to an incident and you were going a long distance, you had to run through a checklist to make sure that your crew was healthy and it was safe for you to travel. Things like testing, screening, quarantine, and vaccination protocols are all things, those protocols are implemented at the system level, right? And they have to be implemented. It's not just like, oh, the wildfire system. That's made up of multiple agencies and stakeholders. So all of that happens collectively for multiple people. It has to happen with everybody or it doesn't work as well, right? And then the last mitigation, it's not really mitigation, but was really important, was the sharing of lessons learned. There were networks that got formed so that managers and people on the ground could actually share what was working and what wasn't. That's particularly important really early in the pandemic and allowed people to work across agencies, across regions to figure out what's working to slow the spread of COVID-19 in the system, and also what isn't working and why. So I'm going to speak to some of the research projects that we were involved in that actually were able to really facilitate providing context, information, and insights to those on the ground to speak to what actions were particularly valuable. And again, just give good context and information to people. So pre-season 2020, there was a lot of developing the COVID-19 spread mitigation at all levels for the wildland fire system. It was clear we would need these, and developing them was really important. There are two projects I'm going to talk about that we were on, quantifying the spread of COVID-19 through fire camps, and then examining personnel movement across the country that we were able to help provide some good information. Like I spoke about before, building those networks to enable rapid sharing of lessons learned, a project that I was not personally involved in, but one of my collaborators, Karen Riley, was providing a review of current literature and scientific knowledge, especially early on, taking all the scientific literature that was out there and emerging and putting it in one place and pulling out the most relevant pieces of it so that it was all the stuff that was relevant for fire managers specifically. And that was a pretty cool project. I'm not going to speak to it because I wasn't personally involved, but it was important and again, done by a collaborator here. During the 2020 fire season, it became clear that it would be useful to have an incident level risk management tool, and we were involved in developing the COVID-19 incident risk assessment tool to look at risk on individual incidents in real time. And then the 2020 fire season was really interesting because of the fire activity that occurred then there. The high levels of fire activity occurred in the fall along the Pacific coast, and there was a really high need for out-of-area personnel to come in and support those fires. And looking at where we were getting those personnel from, it was really interesting. I'll speak to this more later, but there was actually an intersection between personnel availability, restrictions due to COVID-19, and fire activity that, again, required a multi-agency, multi-personnel response. And we were involved in an analysis of personnel availability that fall. At the end of the 2020 fire season, before the 2021 fire season started, there were a number of efforts examining lessons learned during 2020. The Innovation and Organizational Learning Group did a number of engagements. Again, I wasn't personally involved, but it was some research that was really useful in helping speak to what worked and what didn't. I was involved in the interagency hotshot crew survey to, again, round up some of those lessons learned. And I'm not going to speak to that here because I speak to it at the end of this session. And then we also looked at some of the long-term implications of endemic COVID-19 because it became pretty clear that COVID-19 is likely not to go away. We're going to be addressing it for a while. So what are some of the systemic impacts we might see? And so we had a research project looking at that as well. And again, a lot of these research projects were looking to provide that context, information, and insights to people on the ground to help figure out what sort of, that collective action as mitigations worked well. So just running through some examples of what these research projects produced. So one example, modeling the spread of COVID-19 through large fire camps. Main motivation for this, pre-2020 season, we didn't know what COVID-19 spread might look like. So what might COVID-19 spread look like in a fire camp? And what mitigations work best to stop that? We looked at 3 different fires. And really one of our key findings, we looked at 2 main mitigations. Increased screening as people entered camp, so trying to reduce people who arrived at camp infected, and then aggressive social distancing. So that means masking, that means just reducing contact with people to try and prevent any spread happening within the fire camp. And one of the key implications of this was on large, long duration fires, such as the Lolo Peak fire, which is one of the fires we used as an example. Aggressive social distancing has an enormous impact on the number of COVID cases that are likely to be seen. That was really, really a clear implication of this result. And this information was given to policy makers and decision makers as they were considering what policies do we need to implement. And also, we hoped this got out to the ground too, to speak to what can you be doing to help with this problem. And of course, masking became very common on incidents, right? That was a thing that was implemented. Another project we were involved in was examining historical personnel mobility. And the reason we were looking at this was that it's well known that in the US, personnel travel long distances to work on large fires. And early on, if you remember, way back in 2020, one of the concerns was people moving from hotspots of COVID. We have those real serious hotspots where there are real high levels of COVID, and then outside of that, low levels. And so there was concern about people traveling from hotspots and taking COVID to areas where it really hadn't been introduced. So this was to provide context to policymakers as they were considering, do we regulate travel and how do we regulate travel, to say, okay, how often do trips occur? How far are personnel going? When is it happening? And what regions are we typically seeing people move between? So this was mostly providing context for policymakers. Another example of research we were involved in was developing risk assessment for large fire camps. It became really clear that at the incident level, it would be helpful to have a way for the incident management team to look at their overall COVID risk at that camp and its risks to firefighter health and also workforce capacity. And so we built this dashboard. The middle picture shows sort of the output, and it gave fire managers a sense for, this is what our risk profile for COVID-19 looks like right now. It was pretty cool because those factors implementing that risk profile could change daily. So you could actually go back and look at previous days and see how that risk profile was changing across the season. The most important thing and the coolest thing about this research was we got feedback from a number of people who used it who said the big thing it did was it facilitated communication. It allowed them to talk to particularly other agency partners and say, all right, here's a clear way to communicate our COVID risk on this fire. And it allowed them to talk about potential mitigations and what that looked like for a specific fire. Another research project we were involved in was looking at personnel availability in the fall. Again, I mentioned this before, but we saw a lot of fire on the Pacific coast in the late season. And there was concern about if that fire on the ground stuck around and we didn't have it under control, and we got a weather event where we needed substantially more personnel, where would we get that personnel from? And so we looked back historically to say, well, historically, where did we get personnel from when we saw bursts of fire activity anywhere in the country, really? And the interesting implication of this analysis was we found that previously there was a high reliance along the Pacific coast on fire crews from the state of California. And due to COVID, the availability of those crews was severely restricted. And so since the availability of crews was restricted, it gave fire managers a heads up for, if we were to see this fire activity blow up, we need to find other places to fill these personnel demands. The last research project I'm going to talk to you about is looking at systemic impacts of COVID-19 on workforce capacity. And this one is still applicable looking forward as we consider what endemic COVID-19 looks like for the wildland fire workforce. Wildfires do not exist in a vacuum. A large fire occurs, and often it's connected to other large fires simply because the personnel move from one large fire to another. And you can see that in the image. The orange arcs show everybody coming in, even from their home base, to a single fire, example fire. And then the red arcs are the outbound reassignments. It's not people who went home. I only am showing the people who went from that fire to another large fire somewhere in the country. And what you can really see here is, say that fire that's in the center of everything had had a lot of COVID-19 on it, there's the potential for cascading spread. Now, the implications of this research, there were a whole bunch of really interesting ones. The one I'll speak to today is that vaccination made a difference in two ways for the firefighting system. The first way it made a difference is obviously it drops the amount of spread that's happening across the system. But the second way is because if you were vaccinated, you did not need to quarantine when exposed to COVID-19. Because remember, we were looking at this under 2021, early 2021 policies. So if you're vaccinated, you don't have to quarantine. That makes a big difference in terms of the worker days that we miss due to both COVID and COVID quarantines. So that was a sort of implication we could get out of this research. So give you an overview of all that research. Looking ahead, what's research's role in the future? Well, there are still really high levels of uncertainty around some of the executive orders out there and vaccination uptake in the workplace. Executive order definitely covers federal agencies. There are agencies who work in wildland fire who do not have a similar vaccination order. So vaccination uptake across the wildland fire workforce is an uncertainty. The intentions and capabilities to scale up testing for screening purposes at large incidents. Is that going to happen? The degree to which COVID-19 is becoming endemic and continues to be a health problem. And plans to continue use of an incident tracking system to make sure we're tracking COVID-19 happenings on fire. Is that going to continue? All of these things are issues where research really has a role to play in looking at risk assessment, in looking at fire operations, and then looking at public health, and providing, again, context, information, and insights that otherwise would be unavailable. The main takeaways I want you guys to come away with today. First off, addressing COVID-19 spread within the wildland fire system absolutely required collective action. It required lots of personnel across multiple agencies, multiple regions. Those mitigations were undertaken by a ton of people. And it's a collective action problem that we really did address using collective action. It was pretty cool. The interplay between COVID-19 and wildfire management, particularly in the Pacific Coast when we were looking at resource availability, showed how collective action was required to develop solutions to multiple interrelated problems. And third, and what I hope is the most important, what I really want you to take away is when we're looking at these problems that can be solved with collective action or that require collective action to solve them, research should and can provide valuable context, information, and insights in order to facilitate that collective action and figure out what collective action is the most effective. Thanks so much for being here with me today. If I don't have time for comments and questions, I might not. You're always free to contact me at erin.belval@usda.gov, and I'll also check out the Whova chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Erin. I don't think we have quite enough time, although I saw one question in the chat box here or the Whova chat that you might want to take a look at and try to respond to at an appropriate time. Thank you very much. Okay, next up we have Max Nielsen-Pincus. Max is with Portland State University, and he has a couple of co-authors on this paper as well, at least Cody Evers, who is, I believe, a postdoc there now. And the topic is assessing wildfire risk management networks for potential to foster collective action, and something I alluded to in my presentation earlier this morning. So it's nice to see some connections there. Take it away, Max.
All right, thank you, Dan. Hopefully everybody can hear and see my my screen. I guess somebody will jump in and let me know if you can. So as Dan said, the title of the talk today, and on behalf of myself and Cody Evers, who's the co-author on the talk, so we'll be talking about wildfire risk management networks for potential to foster collective action. We'll be looking at some applications from research in the US West. And before I go on, I just want to acknowledge both the Comfort Project, which is a Rocky Mountain Research Station project that has supported this work, as well as a National Science Foundation funded project that we call FireNet that has also supported some of this work. So as Erin talked about kind of what's happening in fire camp or what's happening in the wildland fire response system and collective action that's occurring there, I want to talk about what's happening sort of before and after. So preparing for mitigating and recovering from fire and the relationships that people are building across boundaries to foster collective action. So let me advance the slide. So just a little bit of an agenda. We'll start talking about preparing for wildfire risk, talk a little bit about the cohesive strategy, its goals and implementation. I want to introduce you very briefly to our study areas that we'll look at today. So North Central Washington, the Wasatch region of Utah, as well as Central Oregon. Talk a little bit about our research questions and methods, so how we find and interpret the networks that we're going to look at today. Talk a little bit about bridgers for collective action, those people who are kind of spanning boundaries and connecting otherwise disconnected parts of the network. And then we'll dive into some findings and discussion and primarily focus on how the different models that we see vary across landscapes and regions, and use some kind of cute terminology like donut holes, wagon wheels, and hubs. As a way to describe what we've seen in these three different study areas. So with that, we'll start with the cohesive strategy. So I think we're all familiar with the cohesive strategy as a scientific approach with three main goals: to produce resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, as well as safe and effective response. If you read a little deeper into the cohesive strategy, talks about implementation and focuses primarily on these ideas of strategic and programmatic alignment across organizations and agencies across different levels, from local to state to federal levels, as well as collaborative engagement among the many stakeholders who are involved in the wildland fire risk management system. And so that's kind of led us to look at these local and regional efforts to really rise to this challenge. And so we're looking at how communities and regions are building collaborative capacity across scales to create outcomes like building trust, creating and innovating new pathways for resilience and win-win partnerships so that they can accomplish mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery across different scales. And in order to really understand how regions and communities are doing this, we need an understanding of the partnerships, the bridges that are being built across boundaries, practitioner coordination that's going on, and the formal and informal networks that are working to make this work happen. And we think, at least, that by understanding these factors, that'll give us some ability to better support the actors and the networks that are really helping make the change that needs to occur to address wildland fire risk. So we look at this, we started by looking at this from, and this is kind of drawing on the Comfort Project and Cody's work, my co-author, that's looking at hotspots of wildfire risk exposure across the Western US. And some of Cody's work is what he's found is that about half the communities in the Western US are exposed to some fire risk that comes from the National Forest System. And the vast majority of these communities, about 80%, are concentrated in about 20% of the communities. And those 20% of communities that have the most exposure are further clustered in these kind of what we call these regions of hotspots or regional hotspots of wildfire risk exposure. So we get these geographic hotspots that are these kind of where the dashed circles that you see on the map on the left here are. And so our interest is really understanding kind of what sort of innovations are occurring in those hotspots. And so we've started by taking a look at a few of them and to ask a bunch of questions about the wildfire risk management networks that are emerging in these places. And so you can see the three hotspots that I've outlined here in red are the places that we've worked. If you dig into this map a little bit, the green is the National Forest System. The pink is areas that are communities that are receiving exposure from the National Forest System, and the orange is those areas of the national forest system that are sending that exposure. And so we've worked in 3 of them so far, and we're kind of on the cusp of a 4th one here in Northwest Wyoming, where we're asking questions about who's involved in wildfire risk management, what are their roles, how are they connected to each other, where do they work geographically within these hotspots, to try and begin to identify evidence of cross-boundary relationships that are occurring in each of these hotspots. So we go about this through a sampling process that works something like this. So we start with a workshop in one of these places. We were doing in-person workshops in Washington and in Utah, and then of course the pandemic hit, and so we had to go to virtual workshops, which we did in Central Oregon. We invite some people, and work with local partners to get a diverse group to come to this workshop, explain the project to them, talk through wildland fire, the sort of wildland fire risk management system that they have in the region. And at the end of the workshop, then those participants take a survey in which they answer a number of questions, including questions that ask them to nominate other people to participate in the survey that they work with. So it's sort of a chain referral process. And we go through a variety of rounds, and you can kind of see how in the graphic here on the right, how in these different rounds, how the network grows. And by network, we're just looking at the connections that people say, here are the people I work with. And then we go out and survey those people, and they say, okay, here are the other people that I work with. And you get growth in the network over that process. And what you can see here is about 4 rounds of growth from our North Central Washington. And we ended up with about 10. We do about 10 or 11 rounds of this chain referral process. So a little bit of a quick summary on what we found and who we've interacted with across these 3 study areas. And I'll just note that the graphic on the right just is looking at North Central Washington. The text on the left is looking at all 3 study areas. But we've had participation from about over 600 research participants who've taken the time to participate in the workshops or in our surveys. That process has identified almost 1,500 wildland fire risk management professionals across 245 organizations. We look at their job titles, over 250 job titles that suggest people who are working everywhere from the response capacity to mitigation and prescribed burning to community organizing, local natural resource planning, et cetera. And we categorize all these people into 6 or 7 different broad affiliations. And we look at the relationships between the individuals that take the survey and who they work with. We're also kind of looking at what their working geography is, and we won't talk too much about that today, but you can see they participate in a mapping effort through the survey that identifies where they work on the landscape over here on the right, which is North Central Washington. We then, after we've elicited who's in each of these networks, then we follow up with a phase 2 survey that asks questions about trust, priorities and differences in priorities, collaboration, et cetera. So just to begin to orient you to kind of one way to think about this data, the figure on the left here is looking at Central or North Central Washington's network, and the dots here are individuals who either participated in our survey or who are nominated to participate in our survey. And the lines exhibit the relationships between them. The colors of the dots then are those basic affiliations that we just talked about, or those categories of affiliations. So one of the first observations that we have is that each of these networks is large in experience. We found about 65% of our respondents have at least 10 or more years of experience working in wildfire. We also find that each network includes a diverse set of participants, and across all 3 study areas, we find about 1/3 of our participants work for the federal government, many of them with Forest Service or the BLM, depending on the study area. About 1/4 work for local government or fire districts, local fire districts. 21% with state governments, 12% with NGOs, and then a variety of others that include tribal, the private sector, et cetera. And one of the things that we see is that some of these affiliations tend to foster more and diverse relationships. And so, for example, about 40% of our individuals that are nominated across all three of these networks are nominated multiple times, indicating that multiple people are thinking that these are important people to work with. And most commonly, the people who are nominated multiple times tended to be with local government, local organizations. And we sometimes think of these as we also think about people who are boundary spanners or who are connecting otherwise disconnected parts of the network. And one of the things we find is that those people who serve in those kind of boundary spanning roles, they really vary. There's some consistency that we can look at the affiliation level, but there's also variability in terms of the specific individuals. So for example, in Washington, we found that NGO affiliated folks tended to be really important boundary spanners. In Utah, it was the Department of Natural Resources, the state Department of Natural Resources. And in Oregon, we see a local government initiative that really serves that boundary spanning role. Just to kind of look a little bit more, we see some consistency in places around that cross-boundary capacity. So for example, across Washington and Utah here, you can see on the top of the graphs are Washington DNR and Utah DNR folks. And they're broadly networked. And so one of the other ways to think about this is we've sort of put the crosshatch or the bullseye on the network. And so you can just sort of think about they're in all quadrants of the network. They're in the core of the network. They're also on the periphery of the network. And the bottom half of the diagrams show who they're connected to. And so you can see that in both these cases, the state DNR is connected to lots of folks from lots of different organizations that cover at least a fair part of that network space. In contrast, we also see variability. So for example, and not to pick on the Forest Service here, but in Washington, the Forest Service was more peripheral and more isolated to the left side of our network, and therefore separated from the actors that were on the right side. Whereas in Utah, the Forest Service was much more both central and dispersed throughout the different quadrants of the network. So we see some differences in different places. You also see in Utah the connections that the Forest Service had occurred throughout the network, whereas in Washington, they tended to be more on the upper left. And then finally, we'll look at boundary spanners. So here's just another example of these networks. So this is looking at NGOs in central Washington or north central Washington. Those boundary spanners, those people who are filling gaps where holes exist, connecting otherwise disconnected parts of the network. We think of them as people who are critical to that cross-boundary capacity. So like you see here, that Washington, our top boundary spanners were all with NGOs. In Utah, our top boundary spanners tended to be with DNR, as I mentioned a moment ago, but even more specifically, they held a particular role and job title known as the WUI coordinators, Utah's WUI coordinators. And in Oregon, we saw local government and a local government initiative called Project Wildfire that really served that boundary spanning role. So then we can kind of think about the different models. So far we've been looking here as the dots are individuals. Well, here we've kind of aggregated to the level of what I would call organizations or organizational units. And so we've sort of, as we walk through these, we'll walk through each of the study areas, we can kind of see there's some different ways to describe them. So I described this as the Washington's wagon wheel. You sort of have a core here in the middle in the green with local fire districts, Forest Service district level staff, and Washington DNR. Kind of think of that as the fire management triangle that kind of creates the central part of the network, but then is surrounded by these communities of practice in local community, policy-oriented, science-oriented, tribal-oriented folks that surround that core folks who are doing on-the-ground implementation. In contrast, we think of Utah more as a hub and spoke model, where DNR really serves as the central bridge. They're bridging between what we see as a largely federal community of practice, and I've just sort of circled this in the upper ellipse. And I should mention these are quantitatively defined as far as kind of, you can think of it like a cluster analysis, and a lower ellipse on the bottom, which is more of a local community of practice. And so, they're really at the center of those and become an important bridge between them, sort of a hub between these two spokes. Finally, we called, and we're still working with Oregon, so the graphics aren't quite as pretty yet, but we're sort of thinking of Oregon as the donut hole model. And what we found in Oregon was that our central actors were really more distributed across different affiliations. We also see in Oregon less homophily than we saw in Washington and Utah. So people, regardless of what organization they worked for or what affiliation they had, they were connected to lots of people in other organizations, where in Washington and Utah, we saw more of that homophily tend to, sort of cluster with your own people. There was lots of bridging, and we see local actors that are exhibiting kind of high levels of influence. So finally, sort of a last note to end on, and maybe we'll have time for a question or two. Sort of noting this notion of trust and priorities. So first, what we see in the graph here is something what we use from this phase 2 part of the survey, where we follow up with all the people who we've elicited in each of the networks. And so this is just showing Utah's data, for example. On the left side of the diagram is trust in organizations that are working in this network. And on the right side are what we think of as mission alignment or misalignment in this case. So how different are your priorities? And you see that trust in managing wildfire risk is really strongly related to that mission alignment. We also see, and so, the more trust, the fewer differences there are in priorities. And you see that with Utah DNR up at the top, and less trust and big differences with developers at the bottom, at least in Utah's Wasatch region. And so what we see is that in this case, government agencies, tend to be really trusted. They're also are most well represented in the network that we have. And private entities seem to be less well trusted. They're also relatively poorly represented in our networks. And so I think this begins to beg some questions about how we strengthen, how we go about strengthening our wildfire risk management networks. And it may require finding new ways to align missions with currently distrusted or poorly integrated actors in the system. So I just encourage us to think about how do we bring these others into the fold. And so with that, I'll just leave it there, and again, acknowledge the funders for this, both the National Science Foundation and the collaborators in Comfort and the FireNet project. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, or Cody for that matter. And I don't know, Dan, do we have time for any questions?
We do have time for a question or two. I
Okay.
don't see anything yet in the Hoover thing, but let me ask one that actually got directed to me that I didn't get a chance to answer, I should say. And I think if I remember the question correctly, it was sort of like, how are you thinking about, or are you doing anything to monitor sort of change or evolution in these networks over time?
Yeah, no, Dan, that's a great question, and one that I hope we can. I mean, two answers to that. One is what I would love to be able to do with the right resources would be to be able to go back to these places, re-go through the network survey process again, and be able to actually monitor and see change in these networks over time. Maybe every 5 years or so. The second part of that answer is that in these workshops, both before that we do the network survey, as well as what I've found in the sort of follow-up workshops that we've done after these network surveys, when we're kind of presenting the information back to stakeholders, is that there's ends up being a lot of discussion about why things are the way they are. And how did this network evolve to be the way it is today, and where is it growing towards the future? And so I think we build a lot of intuition about answers to that question, and it's something that we need to sort of apply through the records of those workshops to better be able to represent and communicate. I think we can see in Washington, for example, with the NGOs that we see as playing critical boundary spanners. The fire, one of the things that we heard both before and after we did the survey is that the Fire Adapted Communities network of the Washington Fire Adapted Communities Network really had made substantial investment in the NGOs in the region to better do coordination and outreach to many of the partners. And so I think we see a result of that is, even though we didn't sort of seed the network with NGOs, that they emerged in there. And so we see that change.
All right. Great, thank you very much. I think that pretty much takes up the time. Very helpful. Next up will be Brett Miller, who's a postdoc with the University of Montana, also working with this comfort project. And he has a number of co-authors based mostly there at the University of Montana, and it's going to address the question why wildfire is an increasingly transboundary problem. And so take it away, Brett.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm really excited to be a part of this special session. It's a lot of people, some of whom I know well, some I'm putting faces and names for the first time. They're doing a really great job helping set the stage for the talk that I'm going to give today, which is why I'm going to be talking about why wildfire is an increasingly transboundary problem and how addressing barriers to collaboration and aligning institutional objectives can improve wildfire governance. So first of all, I just want to clarify that, you know, what I mean when I talk about this in a governance framework. So governance being both formal and informal institutions and organizations and their actors, the laws, rules, policies, but also the social norms, traditions, and taboos specific to a particular region. And that wildfire governance therefore includes both the federal agencies that are tasked with managing public land that experience wildfire, as well as state and county agencies and tribes and native nations, but also local entities like fire districts and then, you know, organizations or institutions that aren't necessarily specifically tasked with wildfire risk management, such as conservation districts, HOAs, and then also private stakeholders. And that all of these actors are involved in the sort of larger governance system. And so wildfire risk, as we all know, and at the risk of grossly oversimplifying the problem, they're growing in size and intensity due to biophysical factors such as climate change and the buildup of fuels, and also land use intensification and parcelization, such as the growing wildland-urban interface. And this is making wildfires increasingly cross-boundary, as in they, as we've discussed numerous times today. In fact, I think a major theme of these sessions that I wrote down is that wildfires do not obey boundaries. They move from one land tenure to another, and that might be managed by a different actor or institution. And so that's why the wildfire is actually an increasingly transboundary phenomenon. And this difference in terminology is an emphasis that different actors that manage neighboring lands have different capacities, interests, organizational structures, potentially values. It's that mission alignment piece that I heard Max just talk about. I heard Gretchen talk about it earlier this morning, and how crucial that is to align missions or find ways to align missions. It's the fact that when fire moves across a landscape from across a boundary from one land tenure to another, that's a spatial dimension, obviously, but then there's an institutional dimension that becomes activated. And so it's the fact that, where the term cross-boundary emphasizes the spatial aspect of wildfire moving across boundaries, the term transboundary emphasizes how different levels of authority within and between institutions responsible for managing neighboring parcels can complicate the management. So here, just sort of hypothetically, we have these different parcels of land managed by these different actors, and that when fire spreads from public land to private or vice versa, the actors involved are now very different in terms of how they can operate, what the rules are, what the social norms are, what their values are. And I want to emphasize this is not necessarily very different than what's been said today, but that the term transboundary is just our effort to sort of emphasize that aspect of wildfire transmission, which includes many of the findings that have been discussed today. And so it's consistent with those, and I'm going to try to highlight some of that. But I'm also going to highlight some findings that we have from 90 interviews that we've conducted, from basically across these two dimensions, so from top to bottom and also spatially. So we interviewed folks from the Washington office, and then we also did interviews with federal, state, local, and local partners or managers in Utah and in North Central Washington. That includes 20 interviews that I conducted with identified members of the social network that Max was just talking about. Unfortunately, COVID-19 interrupted our data collection in Northern Utah, so we weren't able to replicate that. So as I go through some of the findings here, sort of selected findings, I want to emphasize how the way that the problem is defined really determines what the participants identify as solutions across these interviews. And these are consistent findings. So for instance, one thing that often emerges is what we call the usual suspects. So the fact that there's just a lack of resources, financial resources, personnel, there's planning processes are difficult. So that's a kind of a structural barrier. Delays due to litigation, lack of public understanding about the nature of wildfire risk and how to address it. Now, what's interesting here is that the solutions to these problems are, so more money, right, would be a solution, streamlining NEPA potentially, that came up in some interviews, limiting litigation somehow, and educating the public somehow. Now, what I want to emphasize here is how the solutions to these problems, the scale of them, as well as asking sort of who can make this happen, what's within the sphere of influence, what can a manager actually achieve? Can they make more money appear? Maybe not. Can they streamline NEPA? Probably not. So then let's compare that to some other narratives that have emerged. Another one was about agency to agency barriers, okay? And I think here you'll see where the emphasis on sort of thinking about wildfire's transboundary is particularly salient. So many participants brought up the fact that these different agencies have different missions and approaches, and you've heard that, I know, today several times. So that's a challenge in order to get that collective action, get that collaboration done. The agencies lack the capacity to navigate differences and build partnerships, and that staff turnover at a more localized scale can limit capacity, or there's can be a loss of collaborative capacity, and that people have established relationships, established trust are gone. And so the solutions to these problems are a lot more attainable. Building capacity for dialogue and partnering are things which are are within our power, within the power of wildland fire managers. Focusing position descriptions and performance evaluations on collaboration, which would structurally allow actors in the governance system to do the kind of work that they might identify as being important, but need to have some kind of support for. And we'll see actually further evidence of this. The career ladders and promotional systems that could allow people to promote in place can help reduce that loss of collective action capacity. Another narrative that emerged in these interviews was the importance of engaging the public early. So the lack of early meaningful public engagement was identified as a real barrier to collaboration when it's needed, and that litigation is potentially a symptom of not doing that work. And so this is showing how, thinking about the problem differently, we can see different solutions. So the solution is in investing in public engagement, collaboration early and often. Max just talked about that with the Washington Fire Adapted Learning Networks. I'm going to talk about that exact finding. Well, not that finding, but findings from our research that support that. And this can increase collaborative capacity without necessarily requiring more funds, because it brings in more partners, it achieves co-management potentially. But the problem being is that it's potentially it's a go slow to go fast solution. So it requires that upfront investment without necessarily a clear idea of how it's going to be instrumentally valuable. So to further sort of exemplify this, I want to talk about those 20 interviews I did with identified members of the social network that Max was just talking about in North Central Washington. So I borrowed your graph here, Max, which I find very aesthetically pleasing. So I was doing interviews with people within this network, and some of my findings that are consistent with this topic is the fact that, just as Max said, having the right people in the right places prior to a series of major fires that happened in 2013 to 2015, many participants identified as being crucial to the successful collaboration of their response and recovery efforts. That because that investment had been done before the incident had occurred, they were more successful when the incident occurred. But participants also talked about the differences between sort of what real collaboration looks like and sort of official collaborations. That there's this sort of institutional game that's being played. And this is a way that they're sort of thinking about the term collaboration as it's being as it's emerging, can also become itself a sort of structural constraint, even a barrier to the kind of informal collaboration that folks identified as being really important. And then speaking of those boundary spanners that Max was just talking about, what these results revealed is that a lot of those boundary spanners, outside of sort of, maybe their identified position where they sit in the network, they also actually outside of that have other identities that really help them achieve those goals. So wearing a lot of hats, that might describe the ways in which, especially NGO folks in this area, have other roles in the landscape that allow them to foster those connections and build that trust. And also that people that are doing a lot of that informal collaboration are really personally motivated, but they do need institutional support. So this came up again and again. It's both. You can't work outside your authority, but it has to be about your personality. So thinking about transboundary fire risk, this is saying that people who are really passionate about bridging those gaps or filling those holes, they still need that structural support to do so. So getting to the misalignment potentially between different missions, or just how the structures of these agencies, do or do not mesh. So what are the implications here? Building alliances and leveraging resources. What are some ways that I want to talk about, some specific ways that this was done in this region? One example I particularly like was this fire resistant plant guide, which is actually a collaborative effort between the Washington State University Master Gardener Program and the Washington State DNR. And so they were able to collaborate to produce this thing, which is potentially bringing in private landowners into this conversation. A lot of participants talked about identifying fuels work that could align with conservation goals potentially, so to do that work ahead of time. And this reminds me of a finding that Gretchen had talked about earlier about how collaborative efforts maybe outside of fire could lead to fire success if necessary. And that's something that folks talked about. Getting work done in some capacity helped them have those relationships in another capacity. Supporting collaboration by adding it to job descriptions and performance evaluations. Chelan County Fire 1, which is actually a local fire district, created a community liaison position solely to do this kind of collaborative work based on the success of the Washington Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, which was then expanded after those series of fires. And then very briefly, I want to talk about at the highest level, our interviews with the U.S. Forest Service Washington office. And what we found here was a lot of cohesion about the problems that are persistent in managing fire risk, now and into the future, but not so much on the solutions. So the collaboration is critical, but it's difficult to achieve. That investments in local community scale are needed, but again, how can this be done? And also really loudly was the need to engage with tribes of sovereign nations better than we are currently doing. But despite agreement about the problem and these sort of loosely defined solutions, there are tensions about how we invest resources to pursue any of these goals. The idea is, what we heard time and time again is that that we're spreading the peanut butter too thin. They mean that, and we heard that in terms of mitigation dollars, which landscapes do we focus for fuels treatments, but also thinking about investment and collaboration is also time intensive, resource intensive potentially. And so the solution is potentially to focus resources on high risk landscapes, but then, okay, well, so how do we define high risk? And that's going to prioritize some landscapes and communities and over others. And so that could be potentially problematic. So, just to sort of wrap up here, back to this, why focusing on wildfire as a transboundary problem is sort of helpful. It's, wildfire is increasingly cross-boundary, and that is activating different actors with different values and different structures, incentives. And so, the collaboration is both more necessary to manage that fire risk as it crosses those multiple boundaries. Obviously, as fire is crossing more boundaries, then more actors are sort of need to be involved. But due to those structural constraints, that collaboration can actually be harder to achieve. That's really the high level sort of takeaway here. And that solutions need to address barriers and align objectives. And this is where I sort of want to end on, that this difference in terminology is helpful, because it's a way that we change the way we think about the problems and make the solutions more obvious. It's a way of sort of emphasizing the institutional aspects so that we can think about solutions that are within our sphere of influence, and how defining the problem leads to different solutions. And we are working on a paper right now where we talk about transboundary fire risk is one of the sort of aspects of fire risk that we think warrants specific governance solutions, and that's the point of this upcoming paper, which will hopefully be submitted soon. So on that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Thanks, Brett. We do have time for a couple of questions. I'm looking, if you have them, you can put them in the WOVA chat. I don't see any quite yet, but I will ask, perhaps you've sort of alluded to this, but you did a series of interviews with the Forest Service Washington office staff, but you also then did, actually before that, you did some interviews in North Central Washington. And so you really have kind of a national perspective versus a local perspective. And I'm just wondering if there's any highlights of the differences that you noted between those two perspectives.
It's interesting because in some ways, I could identify all the ways that they're actually not different in terms of identifying, again, the problem, the need to collaborate, the need to engage with communities. The difference really comes from how to achieve those things. And I think a little bit, it's a difference in, obviously, one of the partners on our paper, on our project, Hannah Brinker-Schmidt, wrote a paper years ago. Where you sit is sort of determines how you see things. It was more elegant than that. But anyway, I think of it all the time because managers sort of, non-Forest Service actors in North Central Washington, and NGO folks that are doing some of this really important work, felt like the Forest Service potentially or other federal partners could be doing more to sort of show up at the table in a way where there's maybe more power sharing going on, and not sort of going in their uniform was actually a specific thing that was identified as being potentially setting the tone in a way that was really not as flat as it needed to be. But then when you talk to Forest Service, employees, both within the system, so in those local interviews, as well as our Washington office interviews, you could really hear the tension that they understood that this is something that they want to do, and they're just trying to find ways to do it within the constraints that they see for themselves and for their organization. And so there's a lot of agreement that we need more collaboration, and I think sometimes disagreement about who or what's responsible for the lack of it.
Okay. Still maybe a minute for another question if it shows up, but I don't see anything here unless my WOVA app is not responding. But any case, very interesting, very helpful to see how both this is working both at a national and local level. Thanks, Brett. I think if we don't get another question, I will just propose that we sort of tee up our next talk here, try to stay on time the best we can. So next we have Matt Hamilton from who's assistant professor of environmental and natural resources at Ohio State University, and he's going to talk about developing a library of community wildfire protection plans as a tool for understanding cross-boundary collective action. I remember wishing there was such a thing many years ago, so I look forward to learning about how that's progressed. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thanks to Mo and Dan for organizing this. This has been really fun to join these couple sessions so far. So thanks for the introduction. I'm going to jump right into things. I'm Matt Hamilton. I'm presenting on behalf of this team. So Max, who presented earlier, he's there. Cody Evers works very closely with Max, Nielsen-Pincus at Portland State University. And then Emily Paulson and Matt Bauer, who are recent graduates of Ohio State and Portland State, respectively, and who co-led one of the studies that I'll describe in a moment. So this talk This is really 2 talks in one, so you're getting something like a double, like a twofer here. And the first part is a presentation of this open database that we've recently made available with all publicly available CW or community wildfire protection plans that we could find within 11 states of the U.S. West. The second part of the talk is like a quick tour through a couple applications of this database that this core team of us, who are, you saw on the previous slide, that we've been, carrying out with an eye really towards kind of demonstrating to the broader community, folks who are here, namely, what sort of opportunities there might be within this database. Okay, so jumping right in. If you're not familiar with community wildfire protection plans, these have been around for a while. So they were introduced in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act back in 2003. We found them as early as 2002. And this is a planning process. It's a planning process. It's got a couple kind of core features, but is open to a lot of kind of local tailoring. So the main kind of criteria is that these plans have to be developed collaboratively, which is to say that there's some involvement of local residents, relevant local actors from fire departments and state and federal agencies as well. And the plans have to characterize or tend to characterize risk, but they have to identify priorities for risk mitigation activities within a specific jurisdiction. And that's really it. And so there's been this kind of proliferation of these plans over the past 20 years. And at this point, we've collected over 1,000 of them just within these 11 states. So you might be wondering, as I was when we first started doing this project, well, what's so special about a plan? And if you were like me, maybe 5 or so years ago, this might be the image that comes to mind when you think about a plan. And specifically, I guess this question is asking, why should somebody who's not within a planning jurisdiction care about CWPP, or who's not kind of at the table? Well, you might care about local engagement and autonomy in land use or fire management decision-making. Well, then who is involved in these plans? We can study that. Or you might care about boundary spanning and risk mitigation at multiple spatial scales. Well, then you might be able to answer, well, are these plans only relevant to the jurisdictions in which they were developed? Or do we see kind of like spillover effects, positive or negative, in adjacent or even far away jurisdictions? Or we might care about efficiency, effectiveness, models of government and governance, and so on. And so then that might lead to questions like, are CWPPs still being used? Are they living up to their potential, or are they just plans sitting on a shelf, so to speak? So at switching gears here a little bit to the database that I mentioned, and at great risk of losing your attention, I've included the link here. So this data set spans 11 states in the US West. I'll show a map in a second, and approximately 1,000 CWPPs, all the plans that we could find from those states. And the data include attributes of these plans. So you can see that here, the spatial data, the boundary of the plan, when they were published, if they were the first plan or a revision of that plan in that jurisdiction, if they were prepared by consultants, and then using some of that spatial data, some other kind of associated social environmental data from the jurisdiction. So that's at the level of the CWPP. We've also made available the plans themselves, which are of course available all over the internet, but here we've centralized them in one place, all the ones that we could find. We're also very interested in the attributes of participation. So a core part of this planning process or planning model is that it's collaborative. There's involvement from local people. And so we've actually collected 20,000 records of participation in plans. So it's not 20,000 people. It's a lot of people participate in multiple plans, but these are spread across those 1,000 plans. So people's full names are provided in the plans. We've anonymized those data in what we've made available online. But there's an ID that would allow a researcher to identify the particular multiple plans that an individual participated in. Of course, the plan, we've identified whether the individual is acting in the role of a consultant preparing the plan on behalf of a community, but also their primary affiliation, so their organization basically, and then we've classified the organization. And then sometimes people have multiple hats, I think, as you pointed out there, Brett, and they've got multiple affiliation names and classes and so on. So currently, one of the easiest ways to access the data is through this story map. So you can look at all the plans across all 11 states, where you can zoom into a particular state. Then you can further zoom into a particular plan. So that's what I've screenshotted here. So this is a plan in California. You click on this link, actually get access to the plan. If you wanted to use different query terms or search and identify plans or data like that, you can also do that. So for example, there's 73 community level plans in Colorado that are less than 10 years old. So we could see that down here. So there's some basic search functions and query functions that are available right now. You might have noticed on that previous slide I put, this is version 1.0. So it's currently living on this WordPress site. We have plans over the next couple months. We're working very closely with folks at FactNet to migrate the database to fireadapted.org. So you'll see it there in a couple months. And a core goal is to really engage with this broad practitioner and also research community to tailor the data and some of the kind of discovery tools, the querying and filtering and so on, to account for feedback from that community. Also, of course, plans are still being produced. In many cases, there's big gaps in our data set. So we're going to be introducing some mechanisms for corrections and updates. And of course, we're interested in feedback from you too. That's one of the major reasons why I'm so happy to be here today. Okay, so here's a snapshot of the data that's there. I mentioned there's 1,000 of these plans. You can distinguish plans in terms of the spatial or administrative levels in which they were developed. So there's hundreds of county level plans, hundreds of community level plans. This is sort of the footprint of this data set here too. And what you can imagine too is with that spatial data, it becomes possible to integrate socio-environmental data, the population, the fire history, and so on, all these characteristics of the land within those jurisdictions of the plans. So that's kind of a spatial snapshot. This shows the longitudinal data dimension of this data set. So it was like a big pulse in the mid 2000s. And then there was some level of revisions, which you see here in black, of plans. The earliest plans emerged right after the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was published or enacted. But what's really interesting is that this is a process that's kind of tapered off a little bit, but not that much. And so we still see a lot of plans being produced every year. Of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity or kind of state to state variation in when CWPPs were developed and when they were revised. So this is the longitudinal scope of the data. As I mentioned, we were very interested in who participated and what hats they wore. So we classified participants. And one of the really nice features of the CWPP model is the emphasis on collaboration and participation. And nearly all CWPP documents actually provide a roster of the individuals who contributed to the development of the plan, along with their organizational affiliation. So here's the classes that we use. So pink and orange is a federal and tribal governmental organizations. Large number from state government organizations, agencies. Green is different, kind of local and kind of semi-local government organizations. Then, of course, community fire organizations, homeowner associations, private residents, nonprofits, businesses, universities. There's a lot of different types of people who participate in these planning processes. And then finally, and this ties in really well with the topic of this special sessions, is the kind of the network dimension of these data. So here's a map that shows the patterns of participation between planning processes. So I'll come back to this map in a minute, but I just want to acknowledge that these data are also available on this website. Okay, switching gears now, I want to present like a very quick overview of several recent and ongoing studies. And my goal here is to really illustrate the broad potential applications of this database for studying cross-boundary or boundary-spanning collective action. So I'm largely going to focus on number 1 and number 2, and then talk about number 3 here, which is a little bit more like initial. So, one key question that might be relevant for a study of CWPPs and all local environmental planning processes, especially those related to risk mitigation, is who's actually at the table. And so you can imagine a planning process in which it's all Forest Service people, all people from the fire department. There would be a lot of participation, but maybe not a lot of representation. So we're interested in predicting or understanding how those characteristics vary as a function of characteristics of the planning process, of the broader planning context, and then also the geographic context in which those plans were developed. So you can think about different levels of participation, of course. Some people might be invited but never show up. Other people are really driving the process, and then sort of everyone who's in between. And so, you can draw a line anywhere here as far as, what's the threshold for participation that kind of counts or that matters. We considered people who were members of the core team or key collaborators in these planning processes. And as I mentioned, the distribution of affiliations or the representation, diversity of different participations within these planning processes matters too. So you can sort of imagine this is a plan, and then these are all sorts of, this might be like federal agency, local fire protection organizations, and so on. So what do we find? Well, a couple key insights here. So there's quite a bit of variation across, all 1,000 CWPPs in terms of, the count, the number of participants, and then also the level of representation or diversity of those participants. We actually found that in revised plans, participation was lower, which might be expected, but representation was actually higher. We also found that the scale of planning drives up participation, which makes sense. These are larger spatial areas with larger populations. There's also a positive relationship between the diversity of ownership types within the jurisdiction of the CWPP and both the level of participation as well as the level of representation. One thing that really surprised us was that plan participation and representation were unrelated to wildfire hazard. So we're scratching our heads about that a little bit. But I wanted to turn gears again here to kind of come back to that map with all those blue lines that show the network across the US West. And what's really interesting here is that if you go back and read the Healthy Forest Restoration Act or some of the really early guidance about how to develop these plans, there's a strong emphasis on collaboration within the planning process, but no emphasis on collaboration or coordination or interaction between these planning processes, even though in many cases they're nested, they're adjacent, or they're interdependent in lots of different ways. So we know that cross-jurisdiction planning is crucial. That's been a core theme of all these talks. And the question is, do we see it anyway, despite the fact that it wasn't kind of a formal requirement? And to the extent that we do, under what conditions? How does it vary in terms of the characteristics of the stakeholders who are doing that work, that cross-boundary work, characteristics of the plans, characteristics of these pairs of plans that might be connected through the same individuals that are participating in both. So to this question, do we see it anyway? Well, yes, we do. And you know that because I already showed this map. But this is actually really interesting because we do see a lot of variation across states, not just in terms of the number of plans, which we already knew, but in terms of that level of cross-planning kind of linkages or participation. I'll just draw your attention here to California, which has, I think, around 230 plans that we were able to find, and Colorado, which has slightly more, I think 259. But despite those relatively small differences, Colorado just lights up as this kind of hub of cross-planning interaction. Whereas California, you see a little bit of kind of interaction down here in the San Diego, kind of Southern California area, a little bit around the Bay Area, but not that much, certainly relative to Colorado, Idaho, and these other states. So then the question is, well, why? What drives that variation? And of course, it's going to be related to these characteristics of individuals who are participating in potentially multiple plans or just participating in one. So if you're a private resident, it shouldn't be surprising that private residents tend to participate in single plans. And if you're a representative of a state or federal government agency or a private consultant, you tend to be participating in multiple plans. And this private consultant piece is really interesting because this could, from a normative standpoint, this could be beneficial or detrimental. These consultants have a great deal of potential to diffuse very innovative practices. They also could kind of, promote like a cookie cutter approach. So we'll come back to that in a later paper, I'm sure. In terms of characteristics of plans, community level plans tended to have more participants who also participated in other plans. County level plans did not. As I mentioned, these plans in California tended to not be that kind of have like participants in other planning processes, in contrast to these plans in Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, and so on. You can see this there. And then finally, we considered, dyads of these plans. And they were more likely to share individuals who participate in both if they experienced similar hazard levels, regardless of whether they were geographically proximate. So they could be on opposite sides of a mountain range or opposite sides of the state. If their hazard levels were kind of approximately the same, well, then they're more likely to share participants. Of course, distance mattered, as you might expect. Proximity and time mattered, and then interdependence of risk. And so for that, we actually considered the likelihood that fires would be ignited in one jurisdiction and spread to the other. So what can we take away from this? Well, as everyone else has pointed out very well, the cross-boundary work is hard. It incurs people incur transaction costs when they do it. And so it's sort of costly from a collective action standpoint, but perhaps it's less so when these jurisdictions are proximate and similar. And so that can be great because it incentivizes or facilitates the sharing of lessons learned among similar CWPPs, or it could be undesirable if it kind of leads to these geographic clustering of like well-resourced communities getting better, more and more well-off, and less well-off communities the same way. So I think I have maybe one more minute here, not that much. Okay, so in the final little bit of time that I've got here, I just want to highlight the third application, which is the most least well-developed. But here we're really turning our eye to this question of how well these jurisdictions match or are coherent with the scales of wildfire risk. And so what you're looking at here, just so this makes a little bit of sense, in yellow is the jurisdictional boundary of a CWPP. And then these little red, these little red dots. So in yellow is the boundary of the CWPP. These little red dots are ignition points for fires that in the simulated world traveled into and exposed houses to risk. And so we can think about this in terms of a fire shed. This is sort of like almost like a watershed, but for fire. So we could sort of imagine this super perimeter that extends beyond the jurisdictional boundary of the CWPP. That planners should be accounting for. And if that boundary is huge relative to the CWPP, well, then that suggests that there's a mismatch relative to if it's much smaller. So this ties in with this whole theory of scale mismatch or social ecological alignment, institutional fit. If you're familiar with those, that's sort of where we situate this work, which assumes that we should see better governance or management outcomes when there's more coherence between these scales. And I'll finally just point out that this is work that's related to this large effort led by Alan Ager and Cody Evers and others, this Fireshed Registry. So what we're trying to do here is to understand how these CWPP jurisdictional boundaries correspond to the predicted fire exposure and the challenges of matching the needs of communities at risk with these national investments in risk mitigation. All right, thank you. I hope I didn't prompt much whiplash with all those different mini studies, but thank you very much for your interest in this work. On behalf of this team, I do want to acknowledge generous support from Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station, also from Ohio State. And I don't think there's time for questions, but if there is, I'd be delighted to field any. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Very interesting. We do have a couple of questions that have come up. I think some of them revolve around kind of how this links up to some of the network discussions that we've had. You could see that you can find that question in the WOVA, which we don't really have time probably to get into. And then we also got a question noting, first of all, that apparently Ohio State beat Duke last night, but also asking about how institutions like the SWAREs, and I'm not sure what a SWARE is exactly, and explain the outsized role of some locations in CWPP participation. But it sounds like there's some questions about some of the ways institutions might be driving these patterns of participation. But I think I got to go on to the next one, or I'll cut into Erin Belval's time. So anyway, maybe you'll have a chance to answer that question offline. Okay, our last presentation of the 10 presentations we've done in these 2 sessions is going to be presented by Erin Belval. She presented earlier in this block, if you will, and she's with the Rocky Mountain Research Station Human Dimensions Program, and she's going to continue with some of the discussion around COVID-related practices, and particularly how they relate to some hotshot crew views of this matter. So take it away, Erin.
Thanks again, Dan, and thanks to all the previous presenters. I've really been enjoying this session. I'm going to bring it back around to large fire operations, and how this particular presentation relates to the collective action theme of this overall session is the collective actions that were taken across the fire suppression system to work on, to address the spread of COVID-19 were both implemented by and affected the boots on the ground, the people who were actually doing the firefighting work, digging line, providing backburns, protecting houses. And so at the end of 2020, we wanted to take a look at how those actions had actually had impacted the people on the ground. And so we surveyed the interagency hotshot crews, and in the United States, there's about 115 interagency hotshot crews. They're crews of 20 people, and they're a really important fire suppression resource because there are limited numbers of them, and every year there are orders for them that are not filled. So they're really important. We thought they'd be a good source of boots on the ground views of, okay, how did this season end up working? I did this work with a whole bunch of different people helped to develop this, but the work I'm presenting today, sort of the wrap up of the survey, was really done in collaboration with Sarah McCaffrey and then Trevor Finney, and this work absolutely would not have happened without them. All right, so diving into the survey methods, the goal of the survey was to understand the hotshot crew experiences with these new practices that were developed resulting from COVID-19. And I covered a bunch of those practices earlier, but I'll speak to the specific ones we surveyed in just a moment. The design of the survey, we developed it in November and December of 2020, and we were hoping to send it out as soon as possible, and then realized sending it out over Christmas break was probably a bad idea. So we sent it out January 11th, 2021. We emailed people to ask them if they would respond to the survey, and we sent it to the hotshot superintendents. There were 114 emails that we sent them to. When we sent it out, we also sent out a message that made it clear that this was supported by the National Fire Crew Program Manager and also the Assistant Director of Operations for Fire and Aviation Management in the Forest Service. So that authorized a lot of the superintendents to actually use their work time to respond to this survey. We asked for 1 response per crew. We sent 2 follow-up reminders. We left the survey open until February 23rd, and we ended up with 84 usable responses, which was a 74% response rate, and we were pretty happy with that. The survey topics that we looked at the geographic area and fire assignments. That was our first set of topics. That was mostly demographics, just looking at who was responding to the survey, where were they from, and what had they done in 2020. We looked at, we asked about pre-fire preparations. So that early season chunk of time when everyone was trying to figure out how they needed to prepare to deal with COVID-19 mitigations during the 2020 fire season. We asked about that. We asked about large fire operations. So we were asking about things that shifted during the actual large fire operational period for them. So the main things we identified pre-survey as being big changes for the crews were the switch to virtual and remote paperwork and briefings, and then also the way that fire camp was organized. So traditional fire camp is everybody is in one place And that was changed. A whole bunch of different things were tried in order to disperse people, so we didn't have all that contact. We asked them about general outcomes of some of these new practices. How did it affect efficiency and effectiveness, and how did it affect health of the firefighters themselves? And then the last section we talked about was, we asked them about specifically COVID-19 practices, testing, quarantine, isolation, and how they've been impacted by that. The really interesting pieces of this work, or the interesting responses, were the large fire operations topics and the general outcomes. And those are the ones I'm going to talk about today, because they really spoke to what things looked like for the boots on the ground in 2020, and how the actions that were being taken to mitigate COVID spread and the policies that were being implemented really affected them. So when we asked them about virtual paperwork, specifically, we asked how well did virtual check-in, virtual demo, and also reporting your time virtually work for the crew. And the great majority of respondents said it was either much easier or easier than what had been done in the past. So virtual paperwork seems to be a fairly good success. We also asked, do you feel that using virtual paperwork affected your crew's ability to perform its duties efficiently or effectively? And then we asked, did you feel like you needed access to additional technology to effectively engage in virtual paperwork? And again, the majority of respondents said it didn't affect their ability to do their duties. And most people said they didn't need additional technology. The people who said they needed additional technology, usually it was around connectivity. So better service so that they can actually get online to access the virtual paperwork, particularly for fires that were rural and connectivity was limited. Providing additional service seems to be a way to solve some of the problems that were encountered as they dealt with this. In addition, things like tablets with cellular capability, that sort of thing came up. When we were looking at and asking about virtual briefings, this was another change that took place in 2020, because again, we were trying to reduce the number of people who were all in one place at one time. And briefings on fires are a place that bring people together. And so many briefings shifted from being in person to virtual, either available online or available by radio. And so we asked the crews overall, did your crew prefer virtual or in-person briefings? And the most frequent response we got was that the crews preferred virtual briefings, followed by no preference for either type of briefing, but there still were a substantial number of people who still preferred the in-person briefing. When we looked at some of the open-ended responses, because a lot of these questions were followed by open-ended responses to allow people to give us a little more detail into the challenges and what they needed. When you look at some of those open-ended questions, the people who prefer in-person briefings, it's all about communication and being able to directly communicate with people, and communicating virtually was really seen to inhibit that person-to-person communication and really transfer information less efficiently. People who liked the virtual briefings were really speaking to, it's much more efficient, it's much more effective. I don't have to be in a specific place at a specific time. I can just attend the briefing virtually and then get back to work. Those results were echoed in the responses to the follow-up questions. Compared to in-person briefings, how effective were the virtual briefings you received this season? And then we also asked, did you find that virtual briefings saved or cost your crew time? And the majority of crews said the virtual briefings were just as effective. Some said more effective. The people who thought it was more effective, also every single one of them said that virtual briefings saved time. And you can see across all of the responses for effectiveness, we saw even when people thought briefings were less effective, we still had respondents saying, but they did save time. And then we have very few respondents saying that virtual briefings cost them time. When we asked about camp preferences, do you prefer the traditional incident command post and associated fire camp, so one place for everybody to come back to at the end of the day to shower, have a meal, and sleep? Or do you prefer FOB, forward operating base combination, so a small incident command post, and then one or more additional operating forward operating bases where people could go for meals, logistics, etc. We also asked if they liked multiple moderate size spike camps. So that's a bunch of little camps with a small incident command post that was available, farther away from that was available to crews. And then the last option we asked about was crews spiking on the line. So that's crews actually camping on the line and not going back to the incident command post daily, but with a full incident command post available to them for logistics as needed. And then we asked if there was any other variation that they would prefer. These this set of camps came out of pre-survey work when we were talking to firefighters about what they had actually encountered that season, 2020. So when we asked them to rank these options for camp setups, and it wasn't a surprise to people who spend time with hotshots that the top ranked option was crews spiking on the line with a full incident command post. So crews really like to be able to camp on the line near where they work, but still have an incident command post so they can deal with logistics as needed. And that was ranked people's top 1 or 2 option by more than half of the respondents to this question. The forward operating base combination with the small incident command post was also popular. And then mid-level people, it was pretty well. Third option is that multiple spike camps with the small incident command post. And far and away, the least popular option was that traditional incident command post where people are going back to camp to eat and sleep. And diving into the reasons for those rankings, it was really interesting. So the reasons that people cited for not liking that traditional fire camp is really encapsulated by one of the quotes we got: sickness spreads and time is wasted. So the health risks were commonly cited as reasons people didn't like incident command posts, the traditional camp structure. So health risks where it's crowded there, it's unsanitary, and sleep was cited very often. So the traditional camp is associated with worse sleeping conditions for the crews. It's noisy, there are lights, and people just don't sleep well. And it's also seen as an inefficient use of time and resources. Mostly that's about driving time. So it can take up to an hour, sometimes more, for people to get from the fire line back to incident command posts. And the hotshots really liked cutting out that driving time. So one of the cons with the traditional incident command post setup is that inefficient use of driving time. The pros of the traditional setup, which there were pros, were that it's more efficient logistically. So it's a one-stop stop, everything's there. Resupply is easier. Resupply we found was an issue that people needed to deal with. And so that easy resupply was a real pro for the traditional setup. And then being able to have hot food, being able to come to a place where connectivity was guaranteed, both operationally and also, so they have personal connectivity, and things like showers and hygiene. And it's also better for communication and meetings because it's a place that you can actually talk to people face to face. When we're talking about crews spiking on the line, this was the alternative that crews overwhelmingly preferred. The pros, better sleep, came up very regularly as being cited as like, we slept better, we were healthier, it was awesome. And also they spoke to being able to accomplish more, mostly because they were cutting out that drive time. Again, less driving was cited. Less driving isn't just about accomplishing more, it's also about reducing those road hazards. And then they spoke to it being healthier, cleaner, and safer. So people really liked this option. Well, crews really liked this option. The respondents really liked it. And then the cons really came down to logistics and supply issues. So it was hard to get food that was warm, on time. Sometimes they didn't feel like they got enough food. Sometimes there was still driving required to go get the food. They had to send someone else to do that. And then supply support was an issue. So getting resupplied as things broke or wore out, and connectivity was an issue. The other options that were sort of, ranked medium, this one was fairly popular. The pros of this forward operating based combination, what we really saw was, again, less driving because you're not going back to a central post, you're going back to somewhere that's a little closer. You have better logistical support than spike camps, so quicker resupply, better food, than spike camps, but not necessarily than that traditional camp setup. And then it's still, people said, you know, it's still a little bit safer, healthier, you still get better sleep, it's still a little less crowded. So that's pros that we saw people report. We saw cons that were reported were things like logistical support, because there could be a time lag in support. Sometimes they found the forward operating bases to be unorganized and not clean. There were fewer amenities at a smaller camp, and this was an issue for some people. And then there were communication issues sometimes when there was poor coordination between the actual incident command post, the main incident command post, and then the line itself. And last, the multiple moderate sized spike camps with a small incident command post. The pros, there's the potential, we heard there's a potential for less driving and you were closer to that smaller moderate sized spike camp. And it's less crowded, you get better sleep. But the cons are it can be poorly organized and you can still see the crowding. So you still see some of the disease spread. Not necessarily COVID, but some of the respiratory illnesses that get passed between firefighters. And it can add driving time depending on where things are set up. So the main camp takeaways, the crews like to camp. They like to be away from the incident command post, but they do like having a logistical one-stop shop. And the potential value of some of the larger camps away from the incident command post, they weren't necessarily well liked, but a lot of the challenges that they saw this year may have been due to the fact that they were just managed poorly because people were figuring things out during 2020. When we asked people about efficiency and effectiveness, the short version is people found that many of the changes promoted better sleep, better conditions, more time on the line, and less exposure driving. So a lot of these changes actually positively affected those working on the line. We asked about physical health to see how people felt their physical health and physical health of their crew members was across the 2020 season. And what we saw was that overwhelmingly, most people said their crew members were actually healthier in 2020. And that had to do with no camp crud, which is a shorthand for a respiratory disease, general, the sort of cold that you get when you're thrown in with a bunch of people. And then better and more sleep, people really they felt like they got better sleep in 2020, and that contributed to better physical health. Mental health, we asked about mental health, and it was really interesting. The most frequent answer we saw was that there was no change in mental health for crew members this season. Then the next most frequent we saw was less healthy, but we did see a substantial number of crews who said their crew members were more healthy. Diving into the open-ended questions on that was really interesting. Those who said that there was better mental health in 2020 usually cited better sleep and higher morale, high crew cohesion. Those who said that the mental health was worse cited concerns about COVID, particularly that general anxiety around COVID concerns that was present during 2020. And so that was the reason for that less healthy mental health. And then one of the things that we did see here was limited socialization definitely occurred, and there were pros to that. It was better for health and sometimes could provide good crew cohesion, but it also was negative because you had the lack of social interaction in and out of work, and it also limited some communication options, particularly speaking to work operations. In summary, overall, changes were beneficial. Beyond COVID. I mean, obviously nobody likes COVID, but a lot of the changes that were tried in the end on the ground, they really liked a lot of them. They found that it increased operational efficiency and it provided for better physical health. Virtual paperwork was overall a plus. The alternative camp structures were definitely preferred. There were the key issues to address with the camps that were not the traditional plus spike camp options, were logistics and interaction and communication, but those issues could potentially be addressed as we move forward with good management. All right, thanks for joining me. I'm going to wrap up. I may again not quite have time for questions, but I'll take a look at Whova to make sure I'm addressing questions there. And as always, please feel free to contact me at erin.belval@usda.gov because I do love hearing from people.
Thanks so much, Erin. I was going to try to squeeze in just, I guess, a question a little bit about, what do you think is durable of these innovations that have come along as a result of COVID? If we get past COVID, do you think these are, was there real learning going on here in terms of how we might rethink some of the ways we run these camps and so forth that might be durable?
I think there was. I think that some of the switch to virtual may stick around. Some of these changes just sort of got pushed onto crews and onto teams because they had to address it, but because of COVID. But there were comments, and this is outside the survey, where people were saying, yeah, but we should have been doing this anyways, right? Like, we should have modernized. So I think some of those changes certainly will stick around. But I'm not sure the survey results address how long we'll see those changes stick around, just because the hotshots were affected by those changes, but aren't necessarily in charge of how those things are operated.
But at least it seems like it opens a window to maybe some innovation. So, hey, well, maybe we don't have to always do things the way we've done them before. And this has sort of prompted that, I guess I'm thinking. Well, again, thank you very much, Erin. I want to thank all of the speakers in both sessions today. I think they were really exciting and interesting, and I learned an awful lot. I also want to thank our producer, Jessica, for help manage our sessions today, and maybe we'll see each other somewhere in virtual space as the conference goes on. Thanks again.